I was very high on the Carolina Panthers entering the 2012 season, and ultimately they made me look a little bit foolish. And I talked about it in the season recap that maybe I had jumped ahead of the gun just a little bit, and I was maybe 1 year too soon with these guys. So in my 2013 season preview for the Carolina Panthers, I came out and predicted them to win the NFC South. I thought they had addressed some of the deficiencies they needed to on the defensive side of the football, and I thought you were going to get a better version of Cam Newton in 2013, and they were going to have enough to win in the NFC South, win that division, and make a little bit of a run perhaps in the playoffs. Now, the funny thing happened on the way. They started off 1-3, and they looked god awful. And it looked like Ron Rivera was not going to be in Carolina much longer, and things were going to potentially start to look very ugly. They were finding ways to lose games that they should have won. And that's not something a good team does, period. But then a crazy thing happened. Ron Rivera became Riverboat Ron. Things really started to come together on the defensive side of the football, and they played outstanding defense for the last 3 quarters of the season. Cam Newton, I feel like, picked up his play a little bit, and not just necessarily from a statistical standpoint, but more importantly, making big plays when his team needed him to make big plays and finding ways to help the Panthers win football games that they should lose. That's what really good football teams do. And lo and behold, after a 1-3 start, the Panthers go 11-1 the rest of the season, finish 12-4, win the NFC South, end up with the number 2 overall seed in the playoffs, got a first round bye to show for it. And then, of course, they get to the playoffs. They host San Francisco at home, and 2 things are discovered. Number one is that the referees were with the NFL. They clearly wanted to see San Francisco and Seattle in the NFC Championship game. Number two, some of the weaknesses of the Panthers were exposed, I feel, primarily on the offensive side of the football. Now, when you look at how this season broke down, the identity of this organization ended up being on the defensive side of the football. You have Star Latulele, you have Greg Hardy, you have Charles Johnson, you have one of the very best middle linebackers in all of professional football in Luke Kuechly. You have Captain Munnerlyn, I feel like, had a really good year at corner for them. They played some really damn good defense. They're not a perfect defense. They're not the best defense in the National Football League. That's the Seattle Seahawks. But they're pretty damn close. And that defense really carried them the last 3 quarters of the season as a primary factor as to why that team ended up winning the division, going 12-4, and getting a home playoff game in a first round bye. Now, offensively, you see a team that I feel like expects too much out of Cam Newton at times, in part because they have failed to surround him with the pieces that he needs. And that's a fact. As talented as the guy is, and he's immensely talented, from a physical tools standpoint, Cam Newton may very well be the most physically gifted quarterback in the National Football League, bar none. But I don't care how physically gifted and talented you really are. You have to have help. And when your help consists of Greg Olson and a 35-year-old Steve Smith, and that's primarily it, you're not doing enough to help the guy. And you are putting too much pressure and too much burden on Cam to have to make all the big plays at the right times. And eventually it's going to bite you in the ass, because the one thing that the Carolina Panthers offense really lacks is explosiveness and the ability to score quickly and the ability to consistently score 30-plus points a game if they really need it. When you look at them at the offensive side of the football, you still have that old two-headed running back tandem of D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart. They spent 2 first-round picks on running backs in the John Fox era, ultimately to not have one feature franchise back. It's not that D'Angelo Williams had a bad year, but this is a guy that's been around since 2006. He's going to hit a wall very quickly. And you still lack that one true feature back that I feel like the Carolina Panthers need. And at some point in time, you threw Mike Tolbert into the mix this year as well. At some point in time, they need to address that as an organization and stop going with this running back kind of trio. And they need to find that one feature back that can establish an identity on offense, that can help the offense establish a rhythm and be a consistent go-to player, a guy that can rush for 1,300, 1,400 yards year in and year out. When you look at their skill players on the outside, this to me is the biggest weakness of this team. What else do you have at wide receiver? You have Brandon LaFell. You have Ted Ginn. You're not winning any Super Bowls with those guys being your number 2 and number 3 wide receivers, and that's a fact. I would be incredibly surprised, even though Jordan Gross isn't getting any younger. And you could say, it's important to protect your quarterback with a good offensive line, and I get that. There will be a lot of talk and focus on them potentially taking an offensive tackle in round one. And I get that and I understand that, but I do think that's a big mistake. I do believe fully that multiple picks in this draft for the Carolina Panthers must be spent, on the offensive side of the football, surrounding Cam Newton with more help, giving him more weapons to throw to ultimately in the passing game. Somebody like an Odell Beckham Jr. out of LSU in the first round comes to mind. He's a guy that can give you those explosive big plays down the field. You can line him up in the slot. He also impacts your team positively on special teams. So he's a guy that can contribute in multiple areas of the game. To me, that would be a great late first round pick. And with this being a class that is deep in wide receivers, you can go back in round 2 or round 3. Maybe you find like a Martavius Bryant out of Clemson or a Jordan Matthews out of Vanderbilt to give you that bigger, more physical red zone and possession type of receiver. That's what the Carolina Panthers need to do on the offensive side of the football. They must go into this offseason in this draft. Like last year, they said our defensive line, in particular in the middle, is our weakness, and we're going to double up there. They need to double up wide receiver in the first 2 rounds of the 2014 NFL draft. On the defensive side of the football, they need to figure out whether or not they're going to re-sign Captain Munnerlyn long-term, and they need to figure out whether or not they're going to re-sign Greg Hardy long-term. Those are 2 important players to that defense, especially Greg Hardy, that if you don't find a way to get it done, if you don't find a way to bring them back, you're going to see a little bit of a regression in the Carolina Panthers in 2014. Ultimately, Ron Rivera saved his job. Riverboat Ron got an extension to show for it, and I feel ultimately that was the right thing to do. The Panthers are a promising team heading into 2014, but they're on that cusp to me, and that cusp that could go one way or the other. If they address the deficiencies on the offensive side of the football and find a way to especially retain Greg Hardy, to me, they're a team that will be potentially Super Bowl picks for a lot of people in 2014. But if they foolishly don't address their deficiencies at the skill positions on offense and they find a way to let Greg Hardy walk away in free agency, they're going to regress and go right back down to being a 6-10, 7-9 football team. Going to be a very interesting offseason in Carolina for Ron Rivera and the Panthers, no question about it. And all I could say is Cam is asking you and pleading with you and begging with you, give me some help, dog.